the nightmare of a new order. A Führer, his people, and race. Crimes against humanity. A world of chaos and destruction. This is the story of humanity's darkest hour. The Abyss. These are photos of life running a German death camp, which have lain hidden for 70 years. Happy memories for Johann Niemann, an SS officer stationed at the Sobibor camp in Poland. What the images don't show is Niemann and his colleagues killing Jews, which in 1942 they did day after day by the hundreds of thousands. The crimes these men committed are without parallel in human history.
They're pure killing centres, almost the purest embodiment of the Nazi project of genocide.
Sobibor is one of the 4 so-called Operation Reinhard death camps, together responsible for the murder of 2 million Jews in the space of a few months, in a conveyor belt of industrialized killing.
This development shows us today how easy it is to murder a vast number of people with seemingly little effort.
The men in these pictures seem untroubled by guilt. They fill their free time with chess, horse riding, and music, while nearby thousands are gassed. It's a German idyll.
And this is really the great question about World War II, I think, is that how does a society that's so sophisticated and so well educated can turn into a society which shows such indifference or worse to human beings who are suffering.
Spring 1942 is the dawn of humanity's darkest day. (1942). The much-promised knockout campaign against the Soviet Union has deteriorated into a drawn-out war of attrition. The Red Army is undefeated. The Germans refocus their efforts to the north and south. In North Africa, Hitler's favorite general, Erwin Rommel, is pushing the British army further and further back. The vital city of Tobruk is captured, and German eyes fall on Egypt and Palestine, whose large Jewish population face annihilation. German U-boats continue to harry Allied Atlantic supply convoys. In 1942, they sink more ships than ever before. Hitler's domination extends from the submarine bases of Western France to the Black Sea, from Norway to the deserts of North Africa. Everything changes when a new power joins the war against Germany and her Axis partners, the USA. At the outbreak of war, American arms production lags far behind Germany's. President Roosevelt is determined this will change.
We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself.
Everyone thinks that America enters the war in December 1941, fully fledged as the arsenal of democracy. And it is incredibly misleading because actually when war begins in September 1939, America is languishing miles behind. It's the 19th largest army in the world, sandwiched between Uruguay and Portugal. You know, it's got literally 70 fighter planes. It's got almost no tanks. It's almost got no one making TNT anymore, high explosives.
Roosevelt's strategy is to get the federal government, the US military, and America's biggest corporations to join forces. This will be an industrial armaments program which will surpass that of both Japan and Germany.
That America shall become the invincible fortress of freedom.
Roosevelt's wild promise to build 50,000 aircraft in a single year is soon more than doubled.
America's industrial capacity is simply second to none. It has all the resources that it needs to mobilize an unprecedentedly large war effort, and it has extremely high technology that will put America in a different league by the end of the war.
The Nazis recognize that for all their triumphs, victory is still out of reach. They ready themselves for a simultaneous war of attrition and systematic mass murder.
They have a very clear goal. Our enemies will perish, and our people will live.
Over the next few months, what they call a final solution to the Jewish question will plumb new, unimagined depths.
There must be no survivors to seek vengeance. So once started, the Nazis will not stop till the bitter end.
The logistics of killing achieve an industrial scale with terrifying efficiency. A boat trip on the Danube, 1938. Leading Nazis are celebrating the German annexation of Austria. One of them is a 34-year-old SS colonel called Odilo Globochnik.
This is the man who boasted, "I killed 2 million during what the Nazis called Operation Reinhard." He was one of the worst perpetrators of the final solution.
Globochnik is a career Nazi appointed an SS and police leader in the Lublin district of eastern Poland.
Even the SS regard him as a sadist, inflicting gruesome cruelty across the whole of Poland.
Globochnik is an expert in mass killing, in particular the use of gas chambers, in which unsuspecting victims are locked and suffocated by carbon monoxide from vehicle exhaust fumes.
Encouragement and endorsement from on high is regularly received, especially through the personage of Himmler at the head of the SS.
In late 1941, head of the SS Heinrich Himmler gives Globochnik a special assignment: the murder of the bulk of Polish Jews packed inside the ghettos.
This was a region that was home to the greatest number of Jewish communities. Before the war, there were 3.5 million living in Poland, many of them in the east of the country.
Parts of western Poland are absorbed by the Reich, like the city of Lodz, renamed Litzmannstadt. Here the Germans force 160,000 Jews to live in a ghetto under appalling conditions.
They were completely cut off, and their world got smaller and smaller, and the brutality and the violence and the starvation and the illnesses in the ghettos got worse and worse.
Anyone physically able to is forced to work for the German economy. Occupation authorities, including the man who took these pictures, run a regime of exploitation, starvation, and deportations.
Civilian administrators everywhere were deeply implicated in the implementation of anti-Jewish policies, the implementation of segregation, expropriation, moving them out of their houses, moving them into slum areas, ghettos, cutting their rations, ensuring that there were penalties for not wearing the star.
Jews in the Lodz ghetto hope their slave labor will protect them from being killed.
What they were experiencing was so terrible in the ghetto that it was almost impossible to imagine that a worse fate awaited them. So they allowed themselves to think this: if we make ourselves useful, if we show that we can work, we'll be allowed to survive.
In early 1942, the Nazis begin emptying their Polish ghettos, sending their populations to camps built with only one purpose: mass extermination. Kelmo is already up and running. In 1942, the Germans built 3 more camps as part of Operation Reinhard in occupied eastern Poland: Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. A 4th, Majdanek, is added later. They are disguised as transit camps to fool the rivals. Only at the last minute do people realize they're being herded into gas chambers.
That's when the policy switches from we go to a place, we find all the Jews, we kill them pretty much where we found them, to we bring Jews from somewhere else to a place where we will kill them.
The operation is posthumously named for Reinhard Heydrich, the SS general in charge of the final solution, recently assassinated by Czech commandos in Prague. His plan will continue without him. Running the Reinhard camps requires barely 20 or 30 SS personnel, supported by 100 or so Ukrainian guards.
The Jews were unarmed. They couldn't fight back, and by and large, they had no idea what was going to happen to them.
Many cling to the hope that they're there to work. Nothing survives of them but their belongings.
It was only ever about murdering the Jews. The sole economic gain was the property the Jews brought with them to the camps.
Train after train bring Jews to the death camps. More than 10,000 every day. Recent research suggests that close to 1.75 million people are killed in Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka alone, in less than 18 months.
Roughly around 5 in 6 of the victims of the Holocaust are from Poland and the Soviet Union. And the Operation Reinhard camps are devoted to the slaughter of the Jews in really the heart of the old Tsarist Pale of Settlement, where most of the European Jews live.
An enormity without equal across human history.
This was a killing machine that functioned right to the bitter end. Its sole purpose was the mass extermination of Jews deported out of the ghettos.
As a token of appreciation, Johann Niemann and his fellow Operation Reinhard killers are invited on a VIP trip to Berlin. The Führer's office makes sure its executioners and their wives are well looked after. October 1943. A rumor spreads through Sobibor. The SS are about to kill the Jews they'd forced to work as auxiliaries. An uprising erupts, during which Johann Niemann's skull is split with an axe. 200 Jews flee, hunted down by the SS. Most are caught and executed, but almost 50 hide out in nearby forests, survive the war, and tell the world their story. By late 1943, the vast majority of ghetto Jews are dead, and all traces of Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka are to be erased.
Treblinka was bulldozed, and a little house was built on the area, and saplings of trees were planted to make it look as if it was a little settlement. And the idea was to, well, at least we can just pretend that this Jewish population never existed. Even if we're losing the war, we're going to at least make sure that there's no evidence of this crime.
Globocnik, the man who ran the death camps, has done his job.
If you look at Himmler's 1942 correspondence concerning Globocnik, he has no objection to his having murdered Jews, but he was bothered by his bid to find a new wife. That tells us what the killers found important. Himmler would take a very dim view of Globocnik marrying inappropriately, but the fact Globocnik killed millions of Jews was perfectly fine.
Operation Reinhard is at the dark heart of the final solution. But Himmler plans to expand the killings and the mass exploitation of Jews in new and terrible ways. By summer 1942, it's clear that the war will not be over soon. The Red Army and partisan forces are fighting to the death. The Germans lose 100,000 casualties a month, wounded, dead, or captured.
The Eastern Front is just a bloodbath. And in the end, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of young men lie dying or dead in the snows or the fields or the wastelands of Central Europe, and they just cannot be reproduced.
The home front has been stripped of manpower. Arms factories employ women instead.
Die Frau hat vielfach in selbstverständlicher Pflichterfüllung den Arbeitsplatz des Mannes eingenommen, der an der Front das Vaterland verteidigt.
From 1942, Hitler's architect, Albert Speer, takes over the arms factories. He reorganizes the entire war economy, introducing mass production. Speer's answer to the labor shortage is to form a vast new army of slaves, POWs, camp inmates, foreign workers. 12 million of them by the end of the war.
The increasing organisation of labour, that corresponds with the phase of the war, the fact that more and more men are being called away to the front, the fact that the army needs more material, equipment, aircraft, uniforms and so on. So there is a need for labour, and so this affects the way in which the extermination of the Jews has this double side to it, some instant death, some slower death through work.
With its millions of slaves, the SS becomes an economic empire, building new types of camp which combine mass murder and economic exploitation. The largest of them is being built on Polish territory that has been absorbed into the Reich, a major railway hub called Auschwitz. Unlike the Reinhard camps, Auschwitz serves multiple functions. Alongside the original concentration camp, the Nazis build a second, the death camp of Auschwitz-Birkenau. And then a third, an industrial complex called Auschwitz-Monowitz.
The scale of the industrial projects there is immense. An entire region of brown coal is going to be transformed into the foundations of a huge chemical industry.
Head of the SS, Himmler, visits the construction site in July 1942. It's a joint venture with German industrialists. They will run the factory. He will provide camp inmates as slave labor. Principal among them, IG Farben, manufacturing synthetic fuel.
The IG Farben industrial complex at Auschwitz is the largest single investment program in industry in the Third Reich in the period of World War II.
IG Farben and arms manufacturer Krupp are just two of the corporations who run Auschwitz-Monowitz, and alongside the SS, profit massively from slave labor.
The war against the Jews is the core of the Third Reich project. But that doesn't mean that it can't be at various moments synthesized with programs which are dictated by an economic logic.
The question they ask, what use can we make of our enemies before they die?
The firms pay a daily rate of between 4 and 6 Reichsmarks to the SS per prisoner. Average life expectancy is 3.5 months. Their hair shaved, numbers tattooed on their arms, They're ready to be worked to death. A sophisticated system of police, SS, railway and civilian authorities ensures an endless supply of workers for Auschwitz from all over Europe. Those being loaded on the trains are told they're simply being relocated. It's a lie. Children, women and the old are murdered in the gas chambers and their bodies incinerated within hours of arrival at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Over 1 million are killed. Only their possessions remain, which the SS steal and reuse.
You see these piles of belongings, you see toys, and you see saucepans, and you see toiletries, and you realise these are the objects of people packing for an unknown destination.
Jews are by far the largest group to be murdered at Auschwitz. But there are other victims of Nazi racial madness, including tens of thousands of Sinti and Roma. The mass murder shows no end in sight.
This extermination machinery was designed to last. In 1943, Auschwitz regional planners assumed the camp would operate for at least another 20 years.
SS personnel are drawn from all social classes and from every corner of the German Reich. These are ordinary men and women whom nobody has forced to come to Auschwitz, unlike their victims.
It costs people nothing to say, I just can't shoot these Jews. Or, as a National Socialist, I'm just not capable of murdering the mentally ill. Nothing happened to them.
Auschwitz only works because its personnel feel no guilt. They tell themselves murdering Jews is right and necessary.
There's a whole level of people who worked for the SS who were terrible criminals and who, for some reason, were either able to get away with their crimes and disappeared after the war or died at the end of the war, whatever, but are very little known by the general public.
Of more than 2,000 SS personnel who worked at Auschwitz-Monowitz and its subcamps, only 4 ever faced trial after the war. Auschwitz-Monowitz is just one of 42,000 camps run by the SS. Nazi propaganda proclaims the Jews are Germany's arch-enemy. They alone are to blame for their fate. The newspapers report nothing. Neighbors note when a Jewish flat falls vacant, but they have no idea where the occupants have been taken and why nothing is ever heard from them. But there are rumors. This film is shot by Nazi officials depicting a so-called evacuation of Dresden Jews who were being held in an old industrial warehouse. Before being sent to the east, they're forced to swap their shoes for grotesque wooden clogs and check their hair for lice. After they've gone, their belongings are auctioned off in full public view. Thousands bid.
Working class women from poorer neighborhoods suddenly start to dress in much more affluent ways, in some cases fur coats.
If you moved into an ex-Jewish apartment in 1943, or even just bought a piano or a household item, and millions of Germans did this, 400,000 in Hamburg alone, are you going to be nervous one of them might come back and confront you?
sie zur Rede stellt.
Millions of people help themselves to Jewish property. Few voice any protest, not least for fear of the Gestapo.
During this period, there were people in Germany who did help Jews in hiding. People we might call quiet heroes or silent heroes. We estimate that as many as 20,000 came to the aid of persecuted Jews across Germany.
They're a tiny number. The great majority stay silent as the trains head for the east.
That, of course, spreads its own information all across Western Europe. And so Jews in hiding in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in France, start to pick up the information.
Across half of the continent, Germans and their collaborators hunt down Jews. Every day, trains arrive at the death camps. Around 30,000 Jews are hiding in the occupied Netherlands, including one family taking refuge above a former nightclub close to Anne Frank's house in Amsterdam. They're in terrible danger, but they choose defiance and courage, captured in this amateur footage they shot themselves. Refusing to despair, they film some amateur drama. Their yellow stars clearly visible. Their flat is a theatre set and includes a secret cupboard in case the Gestapo comes calling. But for all their determined frivolity, they know the writing is on the wall. There's no happy ending. The whole family is betrayed by Dutch collaborators.
It was because hatred for the Jews was so widespread that the Nazis were able to pursue the policies that led to the Holocaust.
Only 2 of the family survive. It's thought the rest are sent to Auschwitz via the Westerbork transit camp and murdered. The Allied powers, however, are starting to gather alarming reports of Nazi atrocities.
The realization that the Jews were being targeted and mass murder was taking place became known to the Western Allies quite early on, really after 1941. The knowledge of the ghettos was certainly in place.
Intercepted German radio communications and telegrams provide early clues. In early 1943, British codebreakers pick up an encrypted telegram marked Top Secret, containing a string of indecipherable letters and numbers. In the year 2000, historians finally crack it. It's a report sent to Berlin, listing the numbers of people killed so far by Operation Reinhard. It boasts that over 1 million have been murdered. Reports of the liquidation of entire Jewish communities spread across occupied Poland. They also reach Rome via Catholic clergy. Pope Pius XII cautiously commits to protecting Rome's Jews, but stops short of openly denouncing the wider Holocaust. He condemns the murders and killings, but fails even to mention the Jews. His inner circle tell him Jewish reports are inaccurate. A senior cardinal warns the Pope the Jews are not to be believed. This suits the Vatican, anxious to stay neutral in the war.
The Vatican did not really care about the Jews for a number of reasons, not least anti-Semitism.
Terrible reports even reach the White House. But how can they be true? A Polish officer and eyewitness makes it to Washington. Jan Karski has escaped the Warsaw Ghetto, but the response he gets is exactly as Goebbels had cynically predicted: incredulity.
He goes to Washington and talks to the Americans, and talks to Roosevelt, in fact, and others. And he gets the response: it's not that I say you're lying, it's simply that I don't believe you. And this was the sort of response because the crimes that were being committed in places like Auschwitz, Birkenau, and Treblinka were so beyond belief that even when information and proof was given, people didn't believe it because it was simply unbelievable.
Meanwhile, the deportations continue from all over Europe, here from Dresden. Jews in both America and Great Britain implore their governments to intervene, to no avail.
People are being murdered. It is unprecedented. This is the moment when we have to be emotional, and if you are not emotional, then you are not a human being.
The BBC receives more and more reports, which they rebroadcast across Europe. Listening to enemy wireless is punishable by death in Germany. In autumn 1942, the BBC reports the deportation and murder of Polish Jews. A German engineer secretly tunes in from his North German home in Celle.
Karl Dückerfelden puts together what he's heard on the radio of the deportation of the Jews being broadcast and the gassing of Jews, which is broadcast by the BBC. And he puts it together with Hitler's prophecies and threats. And he realizes that it's really happening.
Karl Dückerfelden's brother is a soldier on the Eastern Front. When he comes home on leave, Karl asks him if the rumors about the Jews are true.
And instead of denying it, his brother-in-law justifies it. And Dückerfelden tries to protest. They have classic argument. And at a certain point, you can see that he cannot argue back, because all of the public information, all of the moral authority of outside social opinion is on the side of his brother-in-law.
Over the course of 1942, awareness of the mass murder of the Jews grows in Germany. Supported by some, abhorred by others, but accepted by many with blithe indifference. Warsaw, summer 1939. Prior to the German invasion, an American tourist is filming in the Jewish district. Life seems good despite the increasing danger. People are oblivious to the threat facing them. May 1942, Warsaw 3 years later. A German propaganda cameraman films just some of the 450,000 Jews now trapped in an inhuman ghetto, hungry and terrified. Some refuse to accept their fate quietly. Emanuel Ringelblum leads a group of historians who are determined to open the eyes of the world.
Polish couriers succeed in smuggling their reports out of Warsaw into the West. Ringelblum's group are convinced America and Britain in particular will act when they discover the truth about what is happening.
Ringelblum's reports are quoted by BBC radio broadcasts. But still, no help is forthcoming.
And this, as the life in the ghetto got worse and worse, starvation increased, disease increased, and the deportations began to happen, it just felt that those who were still left in the ghetto were so isolated. The Jewish people are going through this on their own, without any help from the rest of the world.
Ringelblum hatches an extraordinary plan to document every aspect of Jewish ghetto life in unsparing detail while they still have the chance, in the hope of better times. Ringelblum's group, formed in secret, call themselves Oneg Shabbat, after the Sabbath, the day they regularly meet. They collect everything that speaks to Polish Jewish culture in the ghetto, letters, photographs and artifacts, in a desperate bid to save them from destruction.
Ringelblum had a clear goal. It was to assemble an archive from reliable sources that would form the basis for a total post-war reconstruction of Jewish history from a Jewish perspective. His collection comprises over 1,000 separate items, leaflets, newspapers, diaries, but also secret communiques from the Jewish resistance, anything to save memory from annihilation.
His collection comprises over 1,000 separate items, leaflets, newspapers, diaries, but also secret communiques from the Jewish resistance. Anything to save memory from annihilation. Ringelblum continues his work, even when Jews are being deported to the death camp at Treblinka in June 1942.
The people from the Ringelblum archive understood that the end was coming, that they were not going to be able to avoid death.
In April 1943, Jews still alive in the ghetto rise up in revolt, in an act of desperate courage.
Many of the people who will participate in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising do it because they know they are not going to live. The one thing that they can decide is on which terms they die.
SS and army forces crush the uprising. 56,000 Jewish insurgents are killed or deported.
The crushing of the ghetto uprising is handed over to an SS guy called Jürgen Stroop, who's particularly brutal and unpleasant man, virulently anti-Semitic, and sees his job of crushing the ghetto as part of the German destiny to erase Jewish culture from Central Europe completely.
Ringelblum buries the archive in boxes and old milk churns, in the hope that one day they will be rediscovered for posterity. Oneg Shabbat are not the only ones trying to save testaments of Jewish life from Nazi destruction. A Jewish photographer based in the Lodz ghetto is assembling his own secret archive. His name is Henrik Ross. His day job is photographing ghetto identity cards, but in a secret sideline, in defiance of German authorities, he takes haunting portraits of fellow ghetto dwellers. He too has to bury his material in order to protect it. After saving his archive, Ringelblum, his family, and Oneg Shabbat members go into hiding.
In 1944, the Germans are tipped off where they are being hidden and round them up. Ringelblum, his wife, his child, and all their comrades are dragged back to the ghetto and shot.
Warsaw after the war. Whole swathes of the city, including the former ghetto, have been pulverized. But somewhere amid the ruins, Rachel Auerbach, a surviving member of Oneg Shabbat, is conducting a search. Miraculously, she relocates the hidden archive, evidence of a world now lost.
It's heartbreaking, it's tremendously moving, because it reflects both the rich culture, these tremendously educated people who are so desperately trying to preserve the heritage of Jewish life and culture which had existed in Poland for hundreds and hundreds of years.
A testament of hope that survives the Holocaust and can speak to future generations.
We know that somewhere on the grounds of the former ghetto there is another milk canister that's out there somewhere, full of archival documents.
The final missing piece of treasure from the ghetto. The longer the war goes on, the more powerful the Allied war effort. By 1942, for every litre of fuel the Germans have, the Americans have 28. By 1943, this vast industrial mobilization is turning the tide of war. Marauding German U-boats are routed in the Atlantic and have to be withdrawn. Vast tons of supplies can now pour into Britain unimpeded. Day and night, Allied heavy bombers hammer targets across Hitler's Europe.
By 1943, 40% of German arms production is consumed by air defense in the West. Tank production accounts for barely 8%. In this war, nowhere in Germany is spared, and the Germans are forced to pull vast amounts of material back to the home front.
In July and August 1943, it's Hamburg's turn.
The vast majority of British bombers get through. It is a perfect weather conditions. There is a gap between the waves. 42,600 people killed. You know, over 6,500 acres of the city completely destroyed.
The destruction shocks and radicalizes many Germans.
Part of the population seriously believed the anti-Semitic myth that it was the Jews who were to blame for the bombing raids.
Confidential SS reports reveal many bombed-out victims blame German crimes in the East for their fate.
Right across Germany by the late summer and autumn of 1943, people are saying, this would not be happening to us now if we had not acted so radically in our treatment of the Jews. But they're also pointing the finger at themselves and saying we are to blame for this because we are only being punished for what we did to the Jews.
In 1943, Nazi authorities turn on the German people. We may have been the ones who organized it, but you knew and you agreed. All of us are complicit. We either win as one, or we all go under together.
They had no other choice. That was Goebbels' point. We have burned our bridges. Our terrible crimes mean there is no going back.
In October 1943, Heinrich Himmler gathers together senior SS, party and administration officials for a conference held in occupied Poznan. He even has his speech recorded.
Ich meine die Judenevakuierung, die Ausrottung des jüdischen Volkes. Es gehört zu den Dingen, die man leicht ausspricht. Das jüdische Volk wird ausgerottet.
He wants to make it very clear to people, we have to do this, it is vital, and I'm going to explain the reasons why, and tell you the whole truth.
Dies durchgehalten zu haben und dabei, abgesehen von menschlichen Ausnahmeschwächen, anständig geblieben zu sein, hat uns hart gemacht.
He wanted to incriminate them. He wanted to make sure that nobody had a plausible deniability, as we used to say. That it was a way that they couldn't say, I wasn't there and I didn't know and I'm not responsible.
Meanwhile, the Holocaust is moving ahead at full speed. The Nazis target ever more Jewish communities for destruction. In April 1944, top diplomatic, police and civil service officials convene in a spa town in Silesia called Krummhübel.
Reading the minutes, it's clear all the participants knew precisely what had happened to the Jews during the final solution to the Jewish question, and also what Europe should look like after the war.
Far removed from the front line and all the bombing, these Nazi officials are busy forging plans to shore up anti-Semitism among Germany's allies and neutral countries.
Even in the war's dying stages, no one paused and said, maybe this has all been a mistake. Maybe we should never have made this our goal or even discussed it. Instead, they carry on, in a way typical of the regime, trying to resolve the final solution of the Jewish question.
But one of those invited cannot attend. He's in Hungary. Just before the conference, German forces occupy their erstwhile ally. They fear Hungary is about to make a separate peace with the Red Army. To prevent this, they take over the government. It's also a chance to help root out the country's large Jewish population. Himmler's deportation specialist, Adolf Eichmann, is already there.
Eichmann arrived in Hungary with about 120 staff. It was really quite a small unit to carry out a huge task of deporting hundreds of thousands of people. He relied on his relationship to members of the Hungarian Interior Ministry who were equally committed to purging Hungary of its Jewish citizens.
The SS, Wehrmacht and Gestapo, together with Hungarian policemen, work closely together under Eichmann's direction. Within weeks, they round up hundreds of thousands of Jews, as well as thousands of Roma and Sinti. It is a death sentence. Their destination is Auschwitz-Birkenau, where new railway tracks have been built to receive them. An SS photographer captures the arrival of one of these Hungarian trains. Historians believe these images are taken to demonstrate to Berlin how efficiently the camp is being run.
They begin deporting Hungarian Jews at a rate of 12,000 people a day to Birkenau. And that takes place over the next few months until the beginning of July. And in that period, something like 300,000 Hungarian Jews are murdered in Auschwitz.
Just as this is happening, Allied reconnaissance aircraft fly over Auschwitz. The vast complex is clearly visible in the aerial surveillance pictures. Finally, the camp is in range of American bombers.
If you'd managed to destroy Auschwitz and Auschwitz-Birkenau, then you might have stopped the actual killing, and you might also have stopped the extermination of the Hungarian Jews.
The Americans refused to risk innocent lives by bombing Auschwitz. But was the decision a tragic mistake?
Well, I personally think that more should have been done, more could have been done, even the bombing of the camps and so on, because I've talked to so many Auschwitz survivors who said, we didn't care if we even died in a bombing, if the crematoria and the gas chambers could have been destroyed somehow.
Tatsache ist, dass es in mehreren Fällen, in denen die Alliierten...
In fact, the Allies bombed several camps suspected of housing crucial war production more than once, killing prisoners in the process. Because inmates were not allowed access to the bomb shelters used by civilian workers.
6 months later, on January the 27th, 1945, Soviet forces finally liberate Auschwitz. The SS guards have long fled, driving most of the surviving prisoners west in a series of death marches. Only a few thousand remain in the camp, more dead than alive. By this point, almost 6 million have been murdered, out of a total of 11 million marked for annihilation by Eichmann at the Wannsee Conference. After the war, the only regret he confesses is not having killed more of them.
The Holocaust has no precedent in the way it transformed an ideology directly into policy.
Beginning with resentment and ending via the stripping of all human rights in mass murder. The Holocaust remains the greatest conceivable crime against humanity.
Where does it begin? It ends with murder and death. But does the Holocaust start with plans for murder from the outset, or just with a desire to discriminate?
War and mass killing are inseparable. To keep killing, the Germans must keep fighting. Only total defeat can break Hitler's deadly compact with his people.